You probably picture Liopleurodon as one of the largest predators to ever exist, a 25-meter sea monster capable of swallowing a bus, immortalized in the BBC's 1999 series Walking with Dinosaurs as an almost unbeatable Jurassic apex hunter. That number has been repeated in documentaries, textbooks, and museum placards for over 2 decades. It's also, according to a new study published in July 2026, essentially fiction. The actual animal was closer to 8 meters long, roughly a third of the legendary figure, and the story of how that 25-meter number got out into the world in the first place says almost as much about how science communicates uncertainty as it does about the animal itself. Today, if you type Liopleurodon into a search bar, you'll probably get images and descriptions built entirely on that original 25-meter figure, a number so deeply embedded in pop culture that it's outlived the scientific caution that should have come attached to it. That's not unusual. Big, dramatic numbers travel further and stick around longer than careful, hedged estimates, especially once they've been rendered in CGI and narrated by a British documentary voice with total confidence. But for over 20 years, that confidence was resting on evidence that even the scientist who provided the original number now openly admits was far too thin to support it. Here's the thing about where that 25-meter figure actually came from. Liopleurodon ferox lived roughly 163 million years ago, during the Middle Jurassic, patrolling the seas that once covered what is now England and France, an area preserved today in a rock formation called the Oxford Clay. The species itself was named back in 1873, based on nothing more than a single isolated tooth. For well over a century afterward, the taxonomy around Liopleurodon stayed messy, with numerous fragmentary pliosaur fossils from the same rock formation getting lumped into the species without particularly rigorous justification, simply because there wasn't enough complete material available to sort out which fossils actually belonged to which animal. That uncertainty is exactly what set the stage for the famous 25-meter estimate. When the BBC was producing Walking with Dinosaurs in the late 1990s, paleontologist David Martill served as a scientific consultant on the episode featuring Liopleurodon, titled Cruel Sea. At the time, a handful of enormous fragmentary pliosaur bones had been found in the same Oxford clay deposits. And given the taxonomic confusion already surrounding the species, it seemed plausible those giant fragments belonged to Liopleurodon too. Working from that fragmentary, incomplete evidence, the production landed on a length estimate of 25 meters, a number that then got broadcast to millions of viewers with the full visual authority of a prestige nature documentary. Martill has since been candid about the decision, acknowledging directly that the estimate reflected the limited evidence and understanding available at the time, and that in hindsight, the size was significantly overstated based on fossil material that simply wasn't strong enough to support such a dramatic conclusion. Now here's where the myth actually gets corrected, and it required more effort than most people would expect. A team at the University of Portsmouth, led by paleontologist Edward Bartlett, conducted what they describe as the first truly comprehensive reappraisal of every single specimen ever assigned to Liopleurodon ferox. Instead of relying on scattered incomplete fragments the way earlier estimates had, the team worked from a genuinely strong evidence base. A nearly complete skull, combined with 2 exceptionally well-preserved skeletons that included extensive body remains beyond just the head. That's a meaningfully different kind of evidence than a handful of disconnected giant bone fragments, because it lets researchers actually reconstruct accurate proportions. How the length of a skull relates to the length of the whole body, rather than guessing at that relationship from partial information, and the result of that reconstruction was decisive. According to the Portsmouth team's analysis, Liopleurodon ferox reached a genuine maximum length of just over 8 meters, roughly 26 feet, dramatically smaller than the 18 to 25 meter range that had circulated in popular science for decades. That's not a minor correction, it's a difference of somewhere between 2 and 3 times the animal's actual confirmed size, essentially the gap between one of the largest predators in Earth's history and a serious apex predator, but a fundamentally different scale of animal entirely. But here's what makes this story genuinely interesting rather than just a simple downgrade, and it's the part most headlines about the study skip past. The researchers didn't conclude that giant pliosaurs never existed in that ecosystem at all. They found something more nuanced. Several of those original fragmentary giant fossils, the very ones that had been mistakenly lumped in with Liopleurodon ferox for decades, do appear to belong to genuinely massive pliosaurs, just not to this particular species. Based on the revised proportional understanding the team developed from their complete Liopleurodon specimens, they estimate some of those separate giant fragments likely belong to closely related pliosaurs reaching lengths of around 12 meters, and in at least one case, potentially as much as 12.2 meters. So, the giants were real. They just weren't Liopleurodon. Somewhere in that same Oxford clay ecosystem, alongside the roughly 8-meter Liopleurodon ferox, there appear to have been other, larger, and still poorly understood pliosaur species reaching lengths comparable to a large bus, animals distinct enough in the fossil record that they can't confidently be assigned a name or a complete picture yet, since the material representing them remains too fragmentary to reconstruct properly. In a strange way, the correction doesn't remove the sea monster from the story. It just reveals that the wrong monster was wearing the crown for over 20 years, while a genuinely separate giant, still largely unidentified, was sitting quietly in the same fossil beds the whole time. And even scaled down to 8 meters, Liopleurodon ferox wasn't demoted to some minor player in its ecosystem. The Portsmouth researchers were clear that, even at its corrected size, it remained the largest confirmed animal in the entire Oxford clay formation ecosystem, and by any reasonable standard, a genuinely fearsome apex predator. 8 meters is still roughly the length of a city bus, and the skull alone made up a disproportionately large share of that length, built around powerful jaws suited to crushing and tearing through other large marine reptiles. Losing 2/3 of its legendary size didn't make Liopleurodon harmless. It just made it a more accurately terrifying animal instead of an exaggerated one. This is also where the story becomes less about one specific pliosaur and more about how paleontology as a field handles uncertainty, and how that uncertainty can quietly calcify into accepted fact if nobody goes back to check it. For over 100 years, Liopleurodon's identity was built on a genuinely shaky foundation. A single tooth as the original basis for the species, followed by decades of loosely assigning other fragmentary specimens to that name simply because nothing better was available to compare them against. The 25-meter figure wasn't a lie or an act of bad science. It was an honest, clearly labeled estimate made under real evidentiary constraints in the 1990s that then got detached from its original caveats the moment it hit television, and simply never got updated in the public imagination even as new, better fossil evidence became available over the following decades. That's arguably the most useful lesson buried inside this story, and it applies well beyond one Jurassic predator. Popular science numbers, especially dramatic ones tied to size, speed, or danger, tend to travel much further and last much longer than the careful scientific hedging that originally surrounded them. A documentary states a number with full visual confidence, and that confidence transfers to the audience regardless of how tentative the underlying evidence actually was. Meanwhile, the quieter, slower work of paleontologists going back decades later to painstakingly re-examine every fragment, cross-reference every specimen, and rebuild an estimate from genuinely solid material almost never gets the same reach as the original dramatic claim did. The correction, even when it's methodologically far stronger than the original number, has to fight uphill against 25 years of cultural momentum. And it's worth sitting with exactly how the researchers got their answer this time, because it's a genuinely different, more rigorous approach than what produced the original figure. Rather than extrapolating from an isolated giant bone fragment and hoping the proportions held, the Portsmouth team built their estimate from animals where they actually had enough of the skeleton to check their own math. A near-complete skull paired with substantial body remains, allowing them to establish reliable ratios between skull length and total body length specific to this species, then apply that same ratio carefully and separately to the fragmentary material, rather than assuming every giant bone automatically belonged to the same animal. That distinction, estimating from a complete, verifiable proportion versus guessing from an isolated fragment, is the entire difference between a 25-meter myth and an 8-meter fact. So the next time you see Liopleurodon described somewhere as one of the biggest predators the ocean has ever produced, that claim is doing double duty, part real, part inherited from a single well-intentioned but under-evidenced guess made for television at the end of the 1990s, one that even its own author has since walked back publicly. The animal that actually swam those Jurassic seas 163 million years ago was smaller than the legend, but not by any means small. Still the apex predator of its entire ecosystem, still built around a skull designed to dominate anything else swimming nearby. It just took over 2 decades, a nearly complete skeleton, and a team of researchers willing to go back and check every single bone in the collection, one specimen at a time, to find out how much of that legendary size was ever actually swimming in ancient waters, and how much of it was only ever swimming in